Não, já tá transmitindo, ok?
Can can we start? They are already starting transmission, if you agree.
I think you have to unmute yourself, Professor Michael. No, I think
I'm fine to start.
so. So just so. Good evening in Brazil, everyone. So it's a pleasure to have Professor Michael LYNK to with his speech, Apartheid and Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Professor Michael LYNK was United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. 2016 2022, and he's also associate professor at the Faculty of Law at Western University, Ontario in Canada. So Professor Michael LYNK, on behalf of organizers, we are glad and honored to have your speech and presentation on the issue, on the subject. So I will pass you the microphone to start the presentation. And if you can, if you want, you can also share the PowerPoint with us and start your presentation. Many thanks. And the microphone is yours.
Well, listen, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored and pleased to be able to do this presentation to Brazil. I'll tell you a little story. My mother's side of the family comes from a tiny village in the mountains of Lebanon, and it's maybe 400 people, and there may be 40,000 people who are descendants from those who've immigrated from Lebanon, and most of them went either to Canada, to various cities and towns throughout Canada, or they went to São Paulo. I apparently have a huge number of relatives living in São Paulo, and fingers are crossed, maybe some of them are attending your law school. So that's doubly gratifying for me to be able to get an invitation from you with respect to this. Let me share my my PowerPoint with you. And I'm going to speak about two related issues today, both of them having to do with Israel, Palestine, and international law. I will first speak about the question of apartheid, and then towards the end, I will try to give some commentary on the recent legal developments, of which there have been many. The important thing to know about international law and Palestine and Israel is that we have plenty of law to be able to assess what is going on, particularly with respect to Israel's 57-year-old occupation of Palestine, with respect to its 7.5-month war on Gaza, and with respect to its defiance of many UN resolutions. The singular thing I think I want to say is that we have lots of law, we have virtually no accountability nor no political will to be able to enforce all of that international law, particularly with respect to Israel. It's sometimes said, and I think there's some truth to this, that in the Middle East, international law is closer to power than it is to justice. So this is a map of the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. The reason I've chosen this particular slide, even though it's probably 9 years old, and I think it's quite representative of what's going on there, is that the West Bank, which you see in all of these little cut up pieces of land in white, the way in which Israel has divided up the West Bank means that there are 165 islands separated from one another, where the Palestinian Authority essentially has control over. And it means that if you want to go from Hebron in the south to Jerusalem in the center, to Ramallah or to Nablus in the north, you have to pass through numerous Israeli checkpoints. The entire population of 3 million in the West Bank, another 360,000 in Jerusalem of Palestinians, are under significant Israeli control with respect to their movements. And then we have Gaza off to our left, where there are another 2.3 million Palestinians. And I will come back to Gaza a little later on. Another important thing to keep in mind is that this is a highly unequal struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. As I say here, militarily, Israel is a nuclear power, one of 9 or 10 nuclear powers in the world, with the strongest armed forces in the region, while the Palestinians have the equivalent of police forces in the West Bank, and they have an organization, Hamas, in Gaza, which has homemade rockets to be able to fire. There is no equivalence with respect to the military power, balance of power between the two. Economically, Israel enjoys a European-style standard of living with a GDP per capita that's around $58,000 American per Israeli. That's 14 times higher than the Palestinian standard of around $3,500 American per capita. Territorially, Israel is by far the overwhelming dominant political power between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, while the Palestinian Authority has islands of land where it has municipal powers in the West Bank, and Gaza, up until recently, obviously Hamas had authority over the small strip of Gaza. Diplomatically, Israel has the enduring support, as we've seen over the last 8 months, of the United States and to a lesser degree of the European Union, while the Palestinians have enormous support, particularly in the global south, that tends to mean less on the balance of power than Israel's alliance with the United States. The only factor where there is equality is between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs demographically, where they each roughly now have roughly 7 million people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The demographic balance of power is that there are now slightly more Palestinians living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan than there are Israeli Jews. Now, when it comes to apartheid, which is the first part of what I want to talk about, I first want to cite several important international and Israeli figures who have all come to the conclusion that what is going on with Israel's rule over the Palestinians amounts to apartheid. Later on, I'm going to take you through the legal definition of apartheid in international law. Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN Secretary General between 2007 and 2016, he wrote 3 years ago in an article for the Financial Times of England, he said, "What has become increasingly clear in recent years is Israel's intent to maintain its structural domination and oppression of the Palestinian people through indefinite occupation, resulting in a situation that arguably constitutes apartheid." A very cautious man. He was a conservative politician in Korea before he went to the United Nations. So this is, in many ways, a dynamic comment by him. We also have the late Reverend Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who was the Nobel laureate during the late apartheid years. He said 10 years ago, "I know firsthand that Israel has created an apartheid reality within its borders and throughout its occupation." And then we have Michael Ben-Yair, who was formerly the Attorney General of Israel between 1993 and 1996. He said in an article 2 years ago, again, "It is with great sadness that I must also conclude that my country has sunk to such political and moral depths that it is now an apartheid regime. This is a one-state reality with two different peoples living with unequal rights." He's not the only prominent Israeli personality, diplomat or political figure who came to the conclusion that there's apartheid in Israel. There are a number of them who've said, obviously they're in the minority, but I think they're looking at their own country with very clear glasses. So let me just briefly take you through the role of apartheid in international law. Obviously, apartheid arises from the practice of racial segregation beginning formally in 1948 in South Africa. Apartheid is the Afrikaners term for apartness, which meant that the white minority in South Africa, which constituted around 15 to 16% of the population, dominated the black and colored population, which amounted to around 75 to 80% of the population of South Africa. That lasted from 1948 until the first free and democratic elections 30 years ago in South Africa in 1994. Because of the blatant racial discrimination in South Africa, and because of the history of decolonization during the beginning in the 1940s and reaching its peak in the 1960s and 1970s, the composition of the United Nations changed greatly. In 1945, the United Nations had 54 members, mostly European countries, some Latin American countries, and North American countries. By 1973, there were well over 100 members of the United Nations, many of them newly decolonized states in Asia and in Africa and in the Caribbean. And together, they led the push within the United Nations to label apartheid as a crime against humanity. And they were successful in 1973 with the United Nations adopting the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of Apartheid. And you can see the definition of apartheid there. I won't take you through it because I'll take you through it in a few minutes. But this was an important legal and political milestone with the adoption of the Convention Against Apartheid 51 years ago. Then more recently, 26 years ago, we have the adoption of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998, which set up the International Criminal Court and which came into business in 2002. And it too had a definition that was very similar to the 1973 definition. There were some differences in secondary issues, but again, the international community stood and said that apartheid is a crime against humanity and it cannot be practiced anywhere. Keep in mind, the Rome Statute was passed in 1998. This is 4 years after the fall of political apartheid in South Africa. So this definition of apartheid by the Rome Statute was meant to look forward. It wasn't meant to condemn apartheid in South Africa. It had already been erased. It meant to say in the future, if there is apartheid, according to the definition I'm going to show you, then that is illegal, and that constitutes a crime against humanity. So the legal definition, combining what we saw in the 1973 Convention Against Apartheid and the 1998 definition in the Rome Statute, is this. There's 3 parts to it. Number one, there has to be an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination. That's the first and most important part. Number two, it was established with the intent to maintain the domination of one racial group over another. And 3, as a part of that domination, there has to be features of inhumane actions or acts that are committed as an integral part of the discriminatory regime. If you can establish all 3 parts of this test of apartheid, well, then you've established that apartheid winds up existing. So then let's take that 3-part test and let's apply that to what is going on in the occupied Palestinian territory. So the first part of the test, as I said, is there an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination? And we can see this through a number of means. First, there is a very distinct and separate two-tier system with considerably different legal rights and political rights in East Jerusalem and the West Bank between the rights enjoyed by Israeli Jews and those not enjoyed by Palestinian Arabs. And so against the very grain of the 21st century, we have Israel assigning or denying these fundamental political and legal rights based entirely on whether or not you're an Israeli Jew or a Palestinian Arab. As well, so looking at the rights that the 740,000 Israeli Jewish settlers enjoy in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, they enjoy the full range of rights that are granted to through Israeli citizenship. They have, obviously here, they have a right to vote. They enjoy, these settlers, which makes up about 10 or 11% of the Israeli Jewish population living in occupied Palestinian territory. They enjoy a European standard of living, as I said, about $58,000 US per capita in Israel. They have all the full judicial and legal rights as an Israeli citizen, and they live in segregated settlements. These 300 or so settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are Jewish only. Palestinians can only enter those, they cannot enter those settlements to live in them. They can only enter these settlements if they have express permission. Usually they go there because they're working as a dishwasher in a restaurant, or they're construction workers building new housing settlements, housing units in the settlements, or they're working in a store or a gas station. These settlements, by the way, these are not autonomous from Israel. They are integral to the Israeli state. They are the largest economic and political project in Israeli history. And every single Israeli government since June of 1967 has supported them, has helped them expand, has extended all these legal rights in Israel to the settlers in the 300 settlements. Side by side in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are more than 3 million stateless and rightless Palestinians living there. They live under a military occupation without any right, and this military occupation doesn't even guarantee the rights that are outlined in the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which is the beating heart of international humanitarian law. If they wound up being arrested by the Israeli army in the West Bank, they don't go to domestic Israeli courts to be tried. They go to Israeli military courts, which have far fewer procedural and substantive protections for the Palestinians. Their economy is depleted. I said earlier, and I repeat it here, it's only 1/14 the size of the Israeli economy. If each Israeli enjoys a per capita income of $58,000 American, each Palestinian living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank is their per capita income is $3,600 per capita. And with respect to strategic fragmentation, Palestinians Palestinians in the West Bank not only do not have the ability to travel to Gaza, Gazan Palestinians cannot travel to the West Bank except in very rare circumstances. West Bank and Gazan Palestinians cannot travel to East Jerusalem. And West Bank Palestinians have a hard time traveling even within the West Bank. Israel has become, if you like, a world master with respect to how to conduct an occupation, with the use of tall walls, checkpoints, guarded gates, no-go zones, making it very difficult for Palestinians to be able to move outside of a very small area, either in Gaza or the West Bank. And we have the continuation of confiscation of Palestinian land, particularly in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, for Israeli settlements, for Israeli only roads and for military zones. The final point I want to make with respect to the first part of the apartheid definition goes to Gaza. And this is a slide I produced before the war began in October 2023. There are 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. They're barricaded. They have very little ability to be able to leave the Gaza Strip. Over half the population of Gaza is under the age of 21, and almost all of them will say they have never left the Gaza Strip in their entire lives. Joseph Borrell, who is the foreign policy chief for the European Union, has called Gaza an open-air prison. He's now changed that since the war began to call it an open-air graveyard. You have drinking water, which is contaminated and very expensive. You have a collapsing, before October 7th, you had a collapsing healthcare system. The World Bank said that the unemployment rate before October was 45% in Gaza. That, the World Bank said, was the highest unemployment rate that it measured in any place where the World Bank does work, which is virtually every country in the world. The poverty rate was at 60% before the war began. The economy was flat on its back. And as I said, you have no ability to be able to freely leave the Gaza Strip. This all amounts to collective punishment, which is a fundamental breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention international humanitarian law. The second part of the three-part test with respect to apartheid is, was this system of discrimination and domination, was it established with the intent, the deliberate intent to maintain the domination of one racial group over another? And I guess I say to you that there's a broad political consensus in Israel that Israel should keep all of East Jerusalem in any final settlement, and keep either all or most of the West Bank as part of Israel, and whatever remains that is given to the Palestinians has to be under permanent security control by Israel. So there's an intent to want to keep this on equal relationship between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. One proof of this, which I point out, is the nation state law of 2018. The basic law of 2018 is a part of what is the quasi-constitution of Israel. Israel does not have a constitution per se. Instead, there are some basic laws passed by the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset, which they say makes up this superstructure of fundamental laws or basic laws. This was passed in 2018 under Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it says, and I'll read, the land of Israel, and that includes, in the land of Israel, the definition of that would be from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So it would be pre-1967 Israel, plus East Jerusalem, plus the West Bank, plus Gaza. The land of Israel is the historic homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. The right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So that means that there's no room at all in the political imagination of Israel for the Palestinian people to have a state or to exercise their own right of self-determination. And let me just show you some quotes from the three most recent Israeli prime ministers. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said when he was Prime Minister in January 2022, he said, there will be no Oslo, meaning the Oslo peace process, as long as I am Prime Minister. And if there is an Oslo peace process forced on us by President Biden of the United States, then there will be no Israeli government. I oppose a Palestinian state, and I am making it impossible to conduct diplomatic negotiations that might lead to a Palestinian state. So there's one example of intent to dominate. The second is former Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who served for roughly 6 or 7 months as Prime Minister in the latter part of 2023. He's he said, my principle says, sorry, the latter part of 2022, my mistake. He says, my principle says maximum Jews on maximum land with maximal security for Israeli Jews and with minimal Palestinians. So this obviously is a thinning out of the Palestinian population and the separation of them behind high walls by which they have no freedom of movement. So he's often seen in the West as a liberal alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu, but I don't think his fundamental policies are any different from what Netanyahu's policies would be. And finally, here's a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu on the day that he resumed being Israeli prime minister at the very end of December 2022. He says, the Jewish people have an exclusive and unquestionable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, in the Galilee, the Negev Desert, the Syrian Golan Heights, and in Judea and Samaria, which is the Israeli code word for the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So he too sees a permanent form of government domination, of state domination by Israeli Jews over Palestinian Arabs. So I think that satisfies the second part of the test, that there's an intent by Israel, represented in the Israeli Jewish government, to maintain domination on racial basis over the Palestinian Arabs. The third and final part of the test is, have there been inhumane acts that have been committed by the discriminatory regime as an integral part of its rule over another people? And I'm not going to take you through this because this would eat up the rest of my lecture, but there are a number of different examples which I detailed in my March 2022 report to the United Nations Human Rights Council as to how Israel is maintaining control through these various inhumane acts of maintaining domination by Israeli Jews over Palestinian Arabs. All of these, I should point out, are illegal and a breach of international human rights law. So I submit, and I'm not the first to have done this, that on this three-part test under international law, Israel is committing genocide, apartheid over Palestinians. Here are some examples of leading international and regional human rights groups who have said the same. Amnesty International made a report in 2022 which came to the same conclusion, and their conclusion was Israel is exercising apartheid over Palestinians anywhere between the river and the sea. They also looked at the conditions of racial domination over the 1.6 million Palestinians who live as Israeli citizens of Israel. I didn't look at that as a UN Special Rapporteur. My mandate was geographically limited to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. But they came to the conclusion that Israel is practicing apartheid everywhere between the river and the sea. The same conclusion came with a Palestinian human rights organization based within Israel, whose staff are made up of Israeli citizens of Israel. And they said that the guiding principles of the new Israeli government, this is the Benjamin Netanyahu government, indicates clear criminal intent to commit crimes under the Rome Statute of 1998, including crimes against humanity, namely the crime of apartheid and war crimes. LYNK is the leading Palestinian human rights organization based on the West Bank. And it came to the same conclusion in its report, looking at the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, and they also came to the same conclusion that this was an apartheid regime of racial discrimination and domination, with the main feature being the 740,000 Israeli settlers living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. But Salem also came to the same conclusion. B'Tselem is the leading Israeli Jewish human rights organization. I think it's based in I think it's based in Jerusalem, but with its headquarters, but with its mandate to look at the occupied Palestinian territory. And it said, I believe, in 2021, you see what I've got underlined there is, he says, Israel accords Palestinians a different package of rights in every one of these units, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and within Israel, all of which are inferior compared to the rights afforded to Jewish citizens. The goal of Jewish supremacy, their term, is advanced differently in every unit, and the resulting forms of injustice differ, but this all winds up being apartheid, they say. So the conclusion from all of this, from my report and from these other reports, is that this is apartheid. I said in my report at the very end, I said it's an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. The only other place in the world where international human rights organizations have said there is probably the existence of apartheid according to that three-part definition is the rule by the Burmese majority in Myanmar over the Rohingya people in the west of Myanmar. So the two current examples of apartheid would be Myanmar and Israel-Palestine. So what does this mean? I'm often asked, what does the future mean? And what are the different end games? So let me just lay out for you very briefly, and I'm happy to take questions from you. What is the end game with respect to this? I'm proposing that there could be 6 different possible outcomes or futures for the 7 million Israeli Jews and the 7 million Palestinian Arabs who live between the river and the sea. Only the first 2 of these outcomes are consistent with international law. The first of this would be a genuine 2-state solution that's based on the 1967 borders. In other words, the Israeli occupation completely ends. All of the 300 settlements are dismantled. All of the 740,000 Israeli Jews living in occupied territory in East Jerusalem and the West Bank return back to the pre-1967 borders of Israel. And Israel and Palestine have equal rights among the nations of the world. The second possible solution or outcome is a one democratic binational state for all 14 million plus people living between the river and the sea, where there's equal rights for all. That also would be consistent with international law, and that's a solution that's consistent with how Europe or North America or indeed Brazil winds up running, that everyone who is a citizen within the boundaries of the country have equal rights that are protected by the political institutions and by the legal institutions in the country. The other 4 possibilities I'm laying out for you, none of them are consistent with international law. They would be illegal. The third is what I call the 1.5-state solution, which was the Trump plan, the Donald Trump plan of 2020, where he said that the Palestinians would get a little rump statelet, a Bantustan in parts of the West Bank and in Gaza, and there may be a transfer of uninhabitable land that Israel presently has to the Palestinian state. But this would not be a state that anybody who studies political science would ever recognize. And I don't think the Palestinians would ever settle for such a solution. The fourth possible outcome is one unequal state, that Israel winds up annexing East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and it probably ignores Gaza as long as Gaza still has a large population of Palestinians living there. And basically they would annex East Jerusalem and the West Bank, but without giving rights to the Palestinians. They may offer them, say, you can live in Ramallah, you can live in Hebron, but you are not going to be given any voting rights with respect to Israel. You can be citizens of Jordan if you want, but you're not going to be citizens of Israel, because that would give a huge demographic change to the composition of the state of Israel. That would be very clearly a pure apartheid state. The fifth solution is no solution. Basically, you keep on managing the occupation with de facto annexation continuing indefinitely. In other words, you continue with what's going on right now, where Israel doesn't make a formal de jure declaration of annexation because it knows it's going to be blocked by Europe or the United States or by the international community. But it continues building more settlements. It continues adding more settlers into the occupied territory, and it continues to make it impossible for any Palestinian state to emerge. And the sixth and final potential outcome is a wholesale expulsion of the Palestinians, which I always thought was probably impossible for Israel to do, but it might be quite possible for Israel to do, particularly with respect to leaving Gaza now entirely uninhabitable and unlivable. And so what does the international community have to do in order to combat this? And I say these 5 aspects are indispensable, are highly important. First of all, there has to be an active international role to intervene to stop Israel from continuing its de jure annexation and de facto annexation of Palestinian territory. The international community has to do more than pass resolutions at the United Nations to make this happen. They have to actually put in issues of boycotts and sanctions against Israel to start making it pay something it's never had to pay, which is a political and economic and diplomatic cost for defying international law and continuing with the occupation. Second of all, any settlement that's reached with regards to Palestinian self-determination has to be based on international law, and it has to be based on international human rights law in particular. It can't be based on realpolitik, which is essentially saying Israel's able to say, we are going to keep all of the settlements and all of the settlers, and you Palestinians can have the rest of the land of the West Bank. That's the way in which all of the negotiations, beginning with the Oslo process in 1993, have wound up being conducted. And every single attempt within the Oslo framework to try to reach a settlement has failed, and it's failed precisely because it's never been based on international law and international rights. It's ignored a rights-based framework. The third is the goal has to be Palestinian self-determination, a genuine self-determination, either an independent Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, or Palestinian self-determination within the land between the river and the sea, and on a democratic one person, one vote basis. The fourth, and this has been missing from Europe and North America, is that there has to be an acceptance that Israel is a bad faith occupier, that Israel has intended to breach all of the main fundamental rules of international humanitarian law and the laws of occupation by wanting to claim sovereignty over occupied land, which has been illegal under international law since the 1940s. And finally, this occupation has to end immediately and with all deliberate speed. Israel can't be given more time to undo what it's done with respect to this. If these 5 factors I suggest are not followed, we're going to be setting ourselves up for more destruction, more wars, more rebellions, more resistance by Palestinians, and more suppression and oppression. Okay, I just want to make a few more comments with respect to international law, particularly as it applies to Gaza and the war that's going on right now. This is the Gaza Strip. This makes up about 1 to 1.5% of Mandate Palestine as it existed before 1948. 50% of the population, as I said, in the 2.3 million Palestinians who live in Gaza are under the age of 21. They're young. it's an intensely young population, and it's only going to grow in the years to come. And 80% of these 2.3 million people who live in Gaza are not originally from Gaza. They are the refugees and the descendants of refugees who fled during the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing in 1948, to wind up in Gaza, always thinking or always hoping to want to return to their original homes, which are now in Israel and are now forbidden for them to be able to return to. This is, I just wanted to give you a signal of the 6 wars that have occurred in Gaza since 2008-09. This is what the Israelis call mowing the lawn. Every few years, it will use its overwhelming military superiority to be able to inflict damage on Gaza in general, as well as trying to aim towards militants in Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And each of these wars is wound up resulting in substantial devastation in Gaza, though nothing compared to what has been going on in the last 7.5 months in Gaza. After the wars on Gaza in 2008-09, 2014, and 2018, the United Nations Human Rights Council set up independent expert commissions of inquiry to examine whether war crimes or crimes against humanity have been committed by either Hamas or by Israel. And each of the 3 reports that have been issued to the Human Rights Council concluded that there were war crimes committed by both Hamas and by Israel, and that there's no accountability going on. So let me give you an example from one of the reports. This is the report in 2015 to the UN Human Rights Council respecting the war that had occurred in 2014. And you can see that the commission says that they were able to gather substantial information to what is underlined to serious violations of international humanitarian and international human rights law by Israel and by Palestinian armed groups. In some cases, these violations may amount to war crimes. The other 2 reports in 2009 and in 2019 also came to the same conclusion that war crimes have been committed by all sides. So what about accountability and impunity? All 3 of these reports also came to the conclusion that there had been no internal investigation with respect to war crimes by Hamas, and no meaningful investigation of war crimes that may have been committed by Israeli soldiers and by Israeli military leaders. The 2009 report to the UN Human Rights Council says that it says the prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory that warrants action. A justice crisis. Those words are as true today, 15 years later, as they were true in 2009. And in 2019, a separate report said, to date, the government of Israel has consistently failed to meaningfully investigate and prosecute commanders and soldiers for crimes and violations. And that has been throughout all 3 reports as well, the inability of Israel to wind up investigating itself. So let me just raise the question, is genocide being committed during the war in Palestine? And I have to be very quick with this because I want to leave time for questions to be asked. But the 1948 Genocide Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute labels genocide as major crimes. It's called the crime of crimes by those who are scholars of genocide and international law. And this is the definition. If you can see the first 4 elements there, if any one of those elements listed there with respect to the definition of genocide has been proven to be committed, then there's genocide. Number 1, the killing of members of a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group with the intent to destroy in whole or in part this particular group. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group Number 3, deliberately inflicting conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Number 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So there's 2 aspects to this, which are similar to most domestic criminal law systems. 1, has there been an act that is a criminal in nature, in this case towards committing genocide? And number 2, has there been intent? So you've got to show both the action and the intention to be able that you're committing genocide. So you will see the comment, which was relied upon by the International Court of Justice in its ruling in January 2024, 4 months ago, where it quoted Israel Herzog, the president of Israel, who said, "We are working militarily according to the rules of international law unequivocally. It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. I see the entire Palestinian nation. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. Absolutely not true." So that's one example of many, many that were made by Israeli leaders, which goes to trying to prove that there's an intent to commit genocide by the Israeli political and military leadership. This was a quick summary of the ruling by the International Court of Justice 4 months ago on the application coming from South Africa under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And the International Court of Justice said in January, they said there's a right of the Palestinians in Gaza to be protected against acts of genocide. They found that there was a link, a relationship existing between the rights claimed by South Africa that the court has found to be plausible, and that at least some of the provisional measures requested. So the court found that there was a plausible case of genocide that had been made out by South Africa in its evidence, in its arguments back in January. And then the court also said, the court considered, and this is in January, this is 4 months ago, at that time the court said that there was a catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip that is at serious risk of deteriorating even further before the court renders its final judgment. So those are the key findings of the court in January. And the court then made several orders to Israel telling it what it had to do. It said it had to take all measures within its power to prevent genocidal acts from continuing. Second of all, it had to prevent and punish any public statements, any public incitement by media leaders, by journalists, by politicians, by military leaders, by soldiers, stating an intent to want to commit genocide against the Palestinians. Thirdly, it said Israel must ensure and enable that basic services and humanitarian assistance enter into Gaza. And fourth, it also called upon Hamas to ensure the immediate and unconditional release of all of the Israeli hostages that it and other armed groups were holding. I'm almost done here. I do want to point out that there is a right of people under occupation or under colonialism to resist their subjugation. And this comes from a number of sources in international law. The one I'm pointing to was passed over 40 years ago by the General Assembly of the United Nations under the right of peoples to self-determination. It said that it reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for their independence by all means, all available means, including armed struggle. But obviously there is a boundary to that, which says that any resistance, including armed resistance by a people under subjugation, under occupation, or under colonialism, must always be within the strict rules of international law. International law applies equally to the occupying power as it does to the people under occupation, but it gives the right to resist an unfair occupation or colonialism to the people, as long as they're doing it in a fair fashion within what international law allows. So this is just a quick summary of the destruction in Gaza. Most of these figures, I'm sure you probably know and are aware of. There's over 36,000 Palestinians that are dead, and likely more than that, but that's the official UN number. Virtually every Palestinian, more than 2.1 million Palestinians living in Gaza, have been displaced from their homes, sometimes 7 or 8 times displaced. There are no fully functioning hospitals left. There's only a handful of hospitals are either minimally functioning anymore. Gaza has been determined to be, most of the housing is gone. Most of the civilian infrastructure is gone. Most of the shops are gone. Virtually all of the schools and universities have been destroyed. There were 11 universities in Gaza. All 11 are either absolutely destroyed or badly damaged. There is famine and acute starvation in almost all of Gaza. Every single Palestinian in Gaza, is determined to be at risk, serious risk of food insecurity, and some where there's already declared to be famine. Before October 7th, there's 500 trucks a day carrying humanitarian aid were entering into Gaza. Since May 7th, since the invasion of the southern part of Gaza and Rafah by Israel, only 50 trucks a day are entering Gaza to be able to supply the needs of 2.3 million people. So the accountability on the genocide, if genocide is found, and the trial that I'm mentioning at the International Court of Justice on the application coming from South Africa, that probably won't be heard in a full argument to the court for another several years. But this is what the specific duties of states are who may be implicated with respect to the relations in this case with Israel. All states have an absolute legal duty to prevent genocide from happening, and if it is happening, to cooperate to bring it to an end. Number two, they have an absolute obligation not to recognize the situation, not to approve of it. Number three, it would be a violation of Article 3 of the Genocide Convention to provide aid and assistance to the state that's plausibly committing genocide. And you can ask yourself, well, what is Germany and the United States doing with respect to their ongoing military shipments of weapons and arms going to Israel? And fourth, they have to enable the criminal punishment of those who may be individually responsible for the commission of genocide. So the final few slides I have here are the role of the International Court of Justice. I want to make it clear that there are two important courts, international courts, that deal with issues involving Israel and Palestine. They have similar names, and they're both based in The Hague in the Netherlands. So it's important to keep them distinct. So this is the role of the International Court of Justice. The court adjudicates disputes between states. It doesn't adjudicate issues involving individuals. It does have jurisdiction in the case both of Myanmar and the case of Palestine to hear claims under the Genocide Convention of 1948 if both states have signed the Genocide Convention. Myanmar has signed the Genocide Convention, which is why it's in front of the International Court of Justice, and Israel and Palestine have signed, Israel and South Africa have signed the Genocide Convention, and therefore that's why they are in front of the International Court of Justice as well. So in February 2024, in May of 2024, the International Court of Justice issued its third round of provisional measures, which are all legally binding on Israel under the Genocide Convention. Among other things, they ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah in the south of the Gaza Strip. That was ordered this past Friday. Israel has not obeyed that. The offensive continues, as well as the killing, as well as the denial of humanitarian aid going in there. Israel has gone through virtually every red light that the United Nations and the International Court of Justice has posed for Israel to stop what it's doing. The other court in The Hague is the International Criminal Court. And that court tries individuals who are alleged to have committed violations of the Rome Statute of 1998, which include war crimes, crimes against humanity, the war of aggression, the crime of war of aggression, and genocide. In February 2021, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court pretrial chamber ruled that it had jurisdiction over any potential violations of the Rome Statute that may occur on the territory of occupied Palestine, which would be, as I said, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So that's why the International Criminal Court has a jurisdiction over any alleged Israeli crimes or war crimes or crimes against humanity committed either in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip. And that's why the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is asking the court to issue arrest warrants for 3 senior Hamas leaders and against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of Israel. And you can see I mentioned there that the arrest warrants were issued last week. And my final slide simply is a quote taken at the end of February, 3 months ago, by Volker Turk, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And he was calling way before this, but he reiterated his call at the end of February for the war in Gaza to end. He said there were clear violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and this includes war crimes and crimes against humanity. And he said there's a need for immediate peace, for war crimes investigations, and for accountability for those who have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. So that's my slideshow and my presentation. I apologize, that's probably taken about 50 minutes to go through, but I hope that you find what I did to be useful to understand the legal aspects of what's going on now in Israel and Palestine and Gaza. And for the next half hour, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Lynk, for your presentation. It was an honor to hear you the second time. The first time I heard your speech was in 2022 in South Africa, in Johannesburg, when Professor Dirk Leddy invited you to present. So it was really an honor for us. You may have also seen now Professor Arlene Klamesha, the other organizer of the forum. She's with us at the room. So I have received 3 questions for the moment, and I will read them in the chat, but I'll also read them. So just 1 minute.
Okay.
The first one came from Ana Cipriano. She asked something really practical regarding the preparation of the report. She asked a practical question concerning the report itself. So, how was your interaction with local organizations and people which helped to provide information to you? So this was,
okay.
I don't know if you want to hear the 3 questions first, or if you want to answer.
No, let's do one after the other, so I remember. So I'll answer this question first.
Okay.
So the question is, what was my relationship with human rights organizations with respect to drafting my 12th and final report on apartheid in the winter of 2022. I would put out a call. I believe I probably put out the call in November or so of 2021, which would go around the world, saying that the Special Rapporteur is planning to address the issue of apartheid and whether apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory. I invite individuals and human rights organizations to make submissions to me. And I received lots of submissions, lots of high quality submissions from individuals and from human rights organizations internationally and regionally with regards to this. So I did a number of Zoom interviews in December, January, and February, and then I started writing my my report, and I relied both on what I was able to gather from the reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, by Al-Haq, by Adela, and many other organizations who were very cooperative in working with me. I obviously sent my request both to the Palestinian Authority and to the Israeli government. The Israeli government surprisingly didn't have anything to say. They ignored the request. But I'd like to think that you can find the fingerprints of these submissions of these individuals and human rights organizations all throughout my report. I was deeply reliant on the reports they had already issued and on their separate written submissions to me. So that's how I did the report. That's how I would done most of the reports, and that's how most special rapporteurs in the United Nations human rights system wind up doing the reports, is by consulting heavily certainly with civil society, but also with academic experts as well.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. I have another question from Carla Mustafa. She wrote something. So what is the impact of a decision like the ICJ, considering that implementation is difficult? Is there an legal solution? I know you dealt with that in your presentation, but I would like to hear a little bit more.
Sure. Look, a ruling, even a provisional ruling by the International Court of Justice, is important. It further stains Israel's international reputation if it's seen to have been found to be plausibly committing genocide, and then again, if it's disobeying orders coming from the International Court of Justice with regards to this. But the only way in which, so it has a political impact, but truly it doesn't have a full impact unless and until it's put into force by the United Nations Security Council. And there at the Security Council, the United States has created an impenetrable diplomatic shield for Israel. Keep in mind that there have been 3 resolutions at the Security Council since December, which are calling for an immediate ceasefire and an end to hostilities in Gaza. And the United States vetoed 3 of them, all 3 of them, allowing it to continue. A 4th resolution was offered up at the end of March by the Security Council. And the United States let that resolution pass because it was it called for only a temporary ceasefire during the remaining 2 weeks of Ramadan. But then as soon as the resolution was passed, with the United States abstaining, the United States said, this resolution is not legally binding. And if Israel needed any green light to continue its military offensive, it took it. So, and that's why South Africa went back for a 4th time in May to the International Court of Justice to try to get it to issue stronger orders. And the court still has some resistance to that. That's why the court only issued an order with respect to an immediate halt to Israel's military offensive in Rafah, that's not consistent with international law. And the problem with that is that Israel has claimed we're obeying a genocide convention, we're obeying the laws of war, we're obeying international humanitarian law. Therefore, we're in entire compliance with any of the orders coming from the International Court of Justice. So the court, I think, has fallen short of its obligations under international law with respect to the orders it's issued. It needs these orders to be more direct, more clearly stated, and it needs to then, I suppose, request the Security Council to wind up enforcing them. But as long as the court issues these orders, even if there may be some ambiguity to them, and the Security Council cannot take any action on this because of the U.S. veto, then this war will continue, and Israel will, I think, probably rely upon the United States to give it more diplomatic shield.
Okay, thank you, Professor Michael Link. And there's another question from Carlos Perini. He has two questions. So I'm copying it in the chat, but the first one is, I would like to know your opinion about the importance of Zionist movement as an intellectual and political movement in the process of imposing apartheid against Palestinian people. And the second one is, I would also like to know if this movement resulted in a secularization and nationalization of Judaism, being the foundation for these acts of violence, is contributing, for example, to the genocidal discourse regarding Palestinians in Gaza Strip. I can repeat that, but I have just copied and pasted in the chat.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can answer it. I'm not going to be able to answer it fully. That's more of a political question than it is a legal question with respect to this. When I was special rapporteur, I said very little with respect to Zionism, if anything, primarily because my focus was trying to ensure that Israel's actions were consistent with international law, and I found that they rarely ever were. I see on the chat the questions from Carlos, but if I can just step aside for a second, certainly Zionism animated the desire to create a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state in Palestine. And if we go back to 1917 is important because that was when the Balfour Declaration by England was issued to the European Zionist movement with respect to Britain's support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So that was one party, the British, promising to a second party, the European Zionist movement, the land and territory of a third people who had no knowledge, no input, no understanding that this was going to happen. And the primary issue with respect to Zionism is that it's what it wanted to do, what it was successful, was to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country. In 1917, at the time of the Balfour Declaration to the European Zionist movement, the population of Palestine was about 700,000 people. 93 or 94% of that population was Palestinian Arab. 30 years later, in 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution to create a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine, the population was around 1.2 million people, of which it was 1.8 million, and 1.2 million would have been Palestinian Arab, and the other 600,000 would have been Israeli Jews or Palestinian Jews at that time. So even though the Jewish population in Palestine was largely immigrant population and only constituted a third of the population, they were granted by the United Nations 56% of the land of Palestine, including the best ports, most of the industry, most of the best agricultural land in Palestine. And then after the war of 1947, 1949, they then wound up with 78% of the land. So Zionism is simply a rekindling of protection for European Jews and Jews everywhere with respect to the age-old persecution that they have faced primarily in Europe, then there should be everybody should be supportive of Zionism. But if Zionism is actually the movement to move European and then later African and Asian Jews to Palestine to replace, not to live with Palestinian Arabs, but to replace Palestinian Arabs as a people, then that is a serious breach of international law. And this all occurred right at the cusp of modern international law changing from the law governing states to also governing profound individual human rights. The period of time when Israel was created in 1948 also was the same time that we saw the creation of the Genocide Act, the Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on Refugees in 1951, and a whole host of other important human rights documents came into that period. And if you like, the creation of Israel through the displacement of the Palestinians was the end, if you like, of a colonial period that was coinciding with the rise of new modern international law and a modern conception of individual and collective human rights.
Thank you, Professor Michael Link. Professor Ellen Clemesha has also a question for you, so I think she will. Professor.
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah.
Hello, Erlen.
Hello, Professor Michael. Thank you very much for that very enlightening and very, very clear presentation. I think it's really helped us a lot to think about what is going on and think about possible outcomes. And I'm sorry I have two connections. It's because I'm not in Sao Paulo, and my computer does not work. The audio does not work on my computer, so I'm using the audio on my phone. So what I'd like to ask you, Professor Michael, is you mentioned among the actions that are necessary at the moment to stop the genocide, to dismantle, or whatever you may call it, apartheid, or how to proceed with this, but anyway, to ensure that international law and international humanitarian law is somehow implemented in regard to the Palestinians in Palestine, in historic Palestine. You mentioned as number one, the application, I'm so sorry about that, the application of sanctions, whatever forms of diplomatic, economic sanctions, military sanctions, the upholding of military envoys, equipment, arms sales, etc., to Israel as an urgent need, at this moment. Now, what would be like the legal basis, how would you put the legal framework and basis to approach different organizations, governments, institutions, civil society, whatever, to defend that this is necessary and this is urgent at the moment?
Very good question. You're going to the very heart of what I've been talking about, Arlene. I guess my primary issue that I would raise is that the 57-year-old occupation could not have continued to be as deep as it is, for as long lasting as it is, unless there was no political will to enforce accountability and end impunity. We would not be at a state where October 7th happened had the international community, particularly the global north, taken its responsibility seriously and taken all of the resolutions adopted by the various bodies and forums in the United Nations seriously 10 years ago, 20 years ago. When I gave my report on apartheid to the Human Rights Council in March of 2022, I said, I would not be in front of you today delivering a detailed report on apartheid as it exists in Israel and Palestine, had the international community taken its responsibility seriously 45 years ago, or 35 years ago, or even 20 years ago, with respect to the framework of international law that you yourselves have created to try to govern Israel's obligations as an occupying power. So I guess then my question becomes, why are sanctions and boycotts and divestment so important with respect to this? It's because Israel has never paid much of a political cost for maintaining and deepening the occupation, and for being absolutely clear to the world that it will never allow a Palestinian state to come into fruition. Israel is a relatively small country, 9 million people who are citizens of Israel, with another 5 million under its domination in the occupied territory. It depends heavily on its international relationships, politically, diplomatically, and economically, in order to be able to survive as a country. It's got an enormous trade with the world, particularly with the global north. 40% of all trade with Israel, both imports and exports, is with the European Union. The European Union has enormous clout on shaping what's going to happen today and in the future with respect to Israel and the Palestinians, if only it would use it. The free trade agreement between Israel and the European Union, right at the very beginning of that agreement, has a human rights clause. All the European Union would have to do is to say, Israel, we're going to trigger this human rights clause and we're going to end our relationships, or we're going to give you 6 months or 18 months to ensure there's a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. That would be, if the European Union had the political will to be able to do that, even though there is also the United States, that would make an extraordinary advance in the possibilities of peace and justice with respect to Israel and Palestine. I remember once an Israeli leader saying, who was critical of his own government's policies, if Israelis would wake up one day and suddenly realize they needed visas to travel to Europe, and visas were being imposed because of Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, you would begin to see a sea change in Israeli public opinion that very day. So I'm a big fan of using this, and certainly I'm old enough, as I look around here, I think I'm old enough to know about the sanctions that were used in the 1970s and the 1980s with respect to South Africa. That was one of the areas that filled up my free time as I was a young lawyer and a law student during that period of time. And I know that while internal conditions within South Africa, the rebellion over and over again by the Black majority population was the main reason why apartheid fell, an important contributing reason to that was the increasing isolation economically and diplomatically that South Africa wound up facing with respect to the rest of the world. And that seems to me to be the only path that's going to bring Israelis to their senses. The final thing I'd say in answer to what your very good question is, when you live in a privileged situation, then sometimes equality, losing that privilege or having equality is a threat to you. And that's what I think probably most Israelis don't have to confront right now, is that they know they have these extraordinary privileges living where they do over the Palestinians, but no one has ever seriously challenged them to imagine life where Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs live on the basis of equality, either in two states or in one state. And to them, if they ever raise the issue, they think the world will end, or the world will burn itself. But in the long run, equality is the only stable basis for living with different peoples with a shared prosperity.
Thank you very much. If I could just extend
Please.
just a little bit that question. Oh, well, thank you. So that means that you do believe that the formulation in this kind of policy should be not until the genocide ends, but until you have equal rights, or until you have the end of apartheid, or some kind of formulation. I do not say until you have two states, because this depends on a political process. But let's say until you have human rights being respected in the region.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that's what I say.
Because countries like Turkey, for example, or some actions by Brazil, they're limited to until the genocide finishes. But maybe that's not the correct formulation.
No, it should be long term. It really. I mean, yes, express your disapproval with the genocide that's unfolding there now, but that energy should be turned into a longer term political vision that there has to be a state. Even Joe Biden says that, even despite the fact that I don't think he has any meaning or any strategy to achieve a two-state solution for them. But even he says we've got to put our energies into a two-state solution to wind up ensuring that these sorts of massacres never wind up happening again. So if even he is on side with respect to that, if only rhetorically, surely more principled countries like Turkey or Brazil, who I think understand the issues of decolonization, who understand the issue, even though they've not been colonized themselves for over two centuries, they understand where the path of the world has to go.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Link. So I have just one last commentary from Professor Paulo Casella, and that's the final commentary because
Okay.
then in 8 minutes. So please, Professor Paulo.
Thank you, Batu. Thank you so much, Professor Michael Link. This was very clear, very direct, very well structured. I have one question to you. That earlier this year, after officers on the human rights protection officers from the UN were barred from going to Israel, and the comment made by some Israeli officials was that the UN should be punished. It is something which is very worrisome as a trend to dare to put things in that way. It is not Israel. Criticizing Israel deserves to be punished, including when it is made as a statement from the UN human rights officers.
It's a very interesting final question to wrap this up. I don't know if you know, but I myself was not permitted to enter Israel during the 6 years that I was special rapporteur. I had lived there before. I worked for UNRWA back in the late 1980s during the first Palestinian uprising or intifada. I had visited on a number of occasions afterwards, but during the 6 years that I was special rapporteur, Israel did not permit me to enter into Israel, and that wasn't personal towards me. It was they hadn't allowed either of my two predecessors to enter, and they don't allow my successor either. As you probably, I think what you're alluding to, Paulo, is that also the fact that the international UN officers working for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights based in Israel and the occupied territory have all been expelled. Their visas have not been renewed, and they have to work remotely with respect to the operation of the offices. And you of course are very familiar with some of the comments made by the current Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, where he said the United Nations should be declared to be a terror organization, that he called for Antonio Guterres to resign because of his stance with respect to the ongoing war. It seems, I'm guessing that may be a popular political strategy by the current Israeli government to demonize the United Nations. And I have my own criticism of the United Nations. I think at its very best with respect to Israel and Palestine, it has been the single most important forum, obviously, for the articulation of Palestinian rights and for the ability of those in the global South to be able to demonstrate their support for Palestine overwhelmingly. But it's rare. The United Nations has rarely been at its very best because primarily of the obstructive work of the global North in general and the United States in particular. I commend to you the 2012 memoir by Kofi Annan, the former United Nations Secretary General. It's called Interventions. And he has a very illuminating chapter on the work of the United Nations in Israel and Palestine. And he says, that the reason why the United Nations has never been able to resolve the very first important international issue on its agenda back in 1947 is because of the possessiveness by the United States over the Israel-Palestine file, meaning that the work of the United Nations Security Council has been paralyzed with respect to this. And I can offer another quote from another respected commentator. I recommend you read the chapter on the Middle East in the 2020 presidential memoir by Barack Obama, where he says that he said a number of important things, but the most ringing thing he said was American diplomats were put in a very difficult position frequently by Israel, where we had to defend Israel publicly on policy issues that we ourselves disagreed with. So he talked about, if you like, the third rail of American politics, which is the place of Israel in American politics. And the fact that Obama himself eventually gave up in 2013 and 2014 with trying to get some kind of final resolution through the work of his Secretary of State, John Kerry, at the time. And he puts the vast bulk of the responsibility, obviously, on Israel regarding this. So I commend that to you as useful recent memoirs by respected figures who I think tell us a lot on how the United States works with respect to Israel and how the United Nations works with respect to Israel and Palestine. Let me leave it there because we're coming close to the bewitching hour of this. But just let me say how grateful I am to all of you to allowing me to want to speak to you. I'm really deeply grateful that you have an interest in what the work I was doing and what the work of the United Nations with respect to this. And let's hope that our paths will cross again at some point soon.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Michael Link. So considering the hour of time, so I'll just close the session. So I would like to thank you, and then on behalf of all the organizers, I would like to thank you once again for the opportunity of having your contribution and presentation. I think that's it. I don't know if Paulo, Arlene, and Felipe want to say goodbye to you also. I don't know.
But I'll say goodbye to them.
Yeah, so,
Thank you.
have a nice rest of the week.
Okay. All the best. Okay. Take care.